Mr. President, this motion is co-sponsored by 5 of my colleagues, Mrs. Tinubu, Gershom Bassi, and Aisha. Mr. President, dear colleagues, the Senate notes that no economy develops without skilled human resources to drive that growth. Hence, Nigeria must prioritize human capital development for its economic growth. We note that human beings are most important and promising source of productivity and economic growth. And so economic and technology are products of human minds and can only be made productive by people. Therefore, the success of any productive program depends on human innovative ideas and creativity. Dear colleagues, we note further that human capital is an important factor used in converting all resources to mankind's use and benefits. Economists observed that the development and utilization of human capital is important in a nation's economic growth. We are aware that Nigeria is blessed with abundant human resources comprising of youthful population which are yet to be harnessed. Aware that the key barometers to gauge the development of human capital are education and health. It is therefore unfortunate that Nigeria as a country has performed not too well in these two key areas. While the education and health sectors are underfunded by government, state and local, the little funding appropriated for these sectors by government and private sector players are mismanaged sometimes, leading to death of human capital. Aware also that tertiary institutions are churning out half-baked graduates that are less useful in the labor market, while capital flight continue to dominate the health sector in the country, with Nigerians seeking medical attention abroad, even as most qualified doctors in the country keep moving abroad at the slightest opportunity. Acknowledges that global economy has shifted to a more knowledge-based sector, such as the manufacture of ICT devices, pharmaceutical, telecommunication, and other ICT-based services. R&D, among others. Skills and human capital development becomes therefore central issue for policymakers and practitioners engaged in economic development both at the national and regional level. Concerned that Nigeria is ranked 152 out of 157 countries on the World Bank 2018 Human Capital Index list, sharing the bottom of the index with countries like Chad, South Sudan, Niger, Liberia. Of the 85.08 million labor force by third quarter 2027, only 7.14% work in any form of industry, including the oil and gas industry. The current poor ranking of Global Human Development Index underscores the fact that more needs to be done urgently to accelerate human capital development in Nigeria. We are concerned also that the number of out-of-school children is increasing. A total of 13.2 million of the basic education school-age children were out of school 2013. This is an increase of 3.3 million from 2010 estimates, and the trend has continued till date. It's even more concerning that out-of-school population About 8 million out of them are girls. Worried that over 100 million Nigerians live on less than 500 per day. Several of these poor households are in our constituencies. At 23%, the unemployment in our country is unacceptably high. It gets more worrisome when you know that a further 20% of the labor force are underemployed. Our youth are made up of 56% of these unemployed. Many unemployed people work in low productivity, low-income jobs with no job or income security, largely in subsistence agriculture. Worried that the total public spending on basic education has around 1.7% of GDP and 12.5% of total public expenditure in 2013, well below the average for sub-Saharan Africa. We are worried, therefore, that Nigeria spends less on health than in any other government in the world. In 2016, public health spending was 0.6% of our GDP. Most of the spending in our schools, hospitals, leaving a little for primary and preventive health care. Healthcare in the country is mainly financed by household out-of-pocket health expenditure, which accounts for about 70%. This is one of the highest level of out-of-our-pocket payment for health in the world, placing us very low and at a very high risk. That this combination of poor health outcome, poor education, poor labor market dim the prospects of enhanced growth and poverty reduction in Nigeria. Our high fertility rate, high population growth, conflicts in several areas, coupled with low investment in health and education and high unemployment. These have dangerous implications for pandemics, migration, and even further conflicts. We further note that investment in human capital development has become more and more important for countries to progress and be competitive. Without rapid improvement in skills, health, knowledge, and resilience, all constituting human capital of Nigerians, we will not have a Nigeria that is very productive, creative, and innovative. We are aware, therefore, that some action have been taken in this regard by federal government, amongst which are the ERGP, the Institution of Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, as regards investment in Nigerian people, the setting up of Human Capital Development, known as HCD, core working group which has articulated HCD vision for country and identified a list of 16 preliminary high-impact interventions to improve the country's index, and the introduction of national social investment programs, and recently establishments in the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs, Disaster Management, and Social Development to implement them. We regret that all this seems not to be enough to tackle the enormous problem affecting human capital development in the country. Mr. President, dear colleagues, human capital is one of the greatest assets, the greatest resources that we have. At 200 million, growing at double digits, that is huge assets. And out of that, to have 40% representing the demography that is very productive but unharnessed and unutilized, that creates a problem. The issue is, how do we harness this demography? How do we translate it to resources? When you look at countries like Italy, countries like Singapore and Philippines, their natural resources is human capital and their GDP is high. And so my view is that we can leverage, and we should leverage on our human capital. We should develop them, we should utilize them, we should indeed export them and then get the wealth from them. Just as we have done with our crude oil, we should make similar efforts in developing our human capital resources. Mr. President, the prayers are as follows. The mandate to plead that, Mr. President, that we mandate the Committee on National Planning, Economic Affairs, Health, Education, Women Affairs, and Youth Development, Labor and Productivity, Poverty Alleviation and Social Welfare, SDG, to convene a special policy roundtable on human capital development to identify policy measures that can enable Nigeria reap democratic dividend. Mr. President, can I make amendment on number 1?
You may do so.
My amendment is to include the Senate leader to lead an ad hoc committee that will comprise this committee on this very important roundtable on human capital development in Nigeria. With your kind permission, Mr. President, that's what I would like number 1 to read. Number 2 is to urge the federal government to immediately set in motion the development of a national human capital development strategy and reform action plan, and ensure immediate implementation of identified high-impact intervention across the country. Urge the federal government to urgently review the national education curriculum to produce market-relevant graduates, and in particular declare an emergency to address girls' education in the country. To urge the federal government to ensure that manpower planning and scale-up entrepreneurship and skill development program, including technical and vocational education. Urge federal government to redouble its resource and mobilization efforts and prioritize human capital development in resource allocation and improve the efficiency of resources use. The last one is to urge the state government to urgently implement the high-impact intervention, prioritizing investments in human capital development, spending more on preventive health care, increasing education enrollment, and reducing the number of out-of-school children and dropouts. Mr. President, I so submit. Thank you.
Oduah, it is very fundamental to realize that human capital is the most important thing anywhere in the world, not only in Nigeria. Of course, in some areas you will say human capital development is not synonymous with education. Because if you look at the issue of Thomas Edison, Dell, Bill Gates, and then even Isaac Newton and Einstein, you will see that there are some problems there because they have not gone through normal structured education. Most of them are also dropouts. But what is fundamental here is to make sure that there is functional education instituted in our schools. By the time we have functional education, anybody who is coming out, he or she knows what to do. And then from there, they are actually tackled to come up with something that will benefit this country. So that when they come out, they know what to do, they know what to expect, and there is ready-made market for them. But in a situation whereby we just sit down and then we begin to teach people something that may not even be useful in the society, I think leaves a lot to be desired. I therefore believe that it's important to go back to the functional education, because she's spoken of. Excuse me. So I think it's important to look at the issue of functional education as the fundamental issue. And if we do that, we will solve all the problem of human capacity. So for me, really, the issue of setting up Human Capital Development Commission or committee may not be necessary. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, the human upon which the wheels of every economic activity of every given nation rotates. And human capital development hinges on the key social infrastructures, which is called health and education. And there's also a correlationship between health and wealth and education and life. We used to define education as a means to life. But we have come to prove ourselves wrong, that education is not a means to life, but education itself is life. So our nation's major problem lies on the fact that we don't even understand the importance of human capital development in running the affairs of our nation. And this is why every day there's this recurring decimal of out-of-school children, economic problems, and we're depending on the resources, natural resources, that God has given us without a human capital development. You cannot give what you don't have. A blind man can never lead a blind man. So there must be emphasis on human capital development to really give to our nation what it needs to drive its economy. If you look at the debates recently, it has been on out-of-school children. Alarming figure of 14.3 million children out of school. Some say 10.4. But Mr. President, you agree with me that 10.4 in Europe is more than 5 countries put together out of school. And what we tend to create in the minds of people is that the children are at fault for not going to school. And we have refused to hold the leaders and ourselves responsible for the failure of our children to acquire the basic human capital for their own development. What education does to somebody is not to add something to you, but to bring out that which God has given to you. And that's what we have simply denied our children from acquiring. So I rise to support this very motion for all it takes and for all its importance, that will begin to drive our nation towards this area. If you look at our budgetary system, not enough is put in this sector. And we tend to misplace the priorities in our system most of the time. And that's what keeps us backward on a daily basis. Japan, Your Excellency, Mr. President, has nothing other than water and rock. But today, Japan is one of the biggest country of the world. Nigeria, with energetic youths, with natural resources, oil, columbine, gold, everything, still is considered a very poor nation. So the poverty of Nigeria is an apparent poverty which does not reflect any practical realities. What I suggest, and as I support my distinguished for coming up with this, is that we should support this motion, and the Senate, just as you have set up committee on security, I wish Mr. President can set up committee on this human capital development. Because if there's a proper human capital development program, then issues of insecurity will be tackled. Now, we're going to go into, last time we talked about our looking for funds. And unfortunately, our budgets might be cut down because if oil remains at 30, then Nigeria has problems. I fear that in the next 4 months or 5 months, we're not paying salaries because we're dependent on oil and everything. And there's nothing to bring from the upstairs. So, with that, I thought most of our attention should have been in this human capital development to help strengthen our economy, such that if oil ceases to exist, Nigeria has something to offer from the brain. What is important now is the brain, not anymore what you have fiscally. So I think, Madam Senator, excellent job, and I hope you can use your power as a woman to influence the Senate President to set up a committee on human capital development. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Aish.
Mr. President, I don't intend to revisit all what has been said by my colleagues over this very important and critical motion that is before the Senate today. Mr. President, my distinguished colleagues, if we look at what has been stated in this motion, clearly the lackadaisical attitudes in this nation to harness the human capital development from both the youths and the women in this country leads to where we are today as far as insecurity is concerned. Because all this that has been stated leads to unemployment, rate of unemployment being increased, the gap between the rich and the very poor being a very big gap, and so on and so forth that I don't need to re-mention again. So, Mr. President, if this motion will be looked at positively and considered, and as what my distinguished Senator Okorocha said, to come up with this committee, including the committee of maybe to join Happiness Committee alongside, it will really solve this problem. Thank you very much.
Is there anybody against the motion? Mandate the committees on national planning and economic affairs, health, education, basic and secondary, and tertiary and third fund, women affairs and youth development, employment, labor and productivity, poverty alleviation and social welfare, sustainable development goals, etc., to convene a special policy roundtable on human capital development in Nigeria to identify policy measures that can enable Nigeria to reap democratic dividends. Those in favor of this prayer say aye. Those against say nay. Urge the federal government to immediately set in motion the development of a national human capital development strategy. Sorry? Okay, as amended. Okay, as amended. Number 2, urge the federal government to immediately set in motion the development of a national human capital development strategy, a reform action plan, and ensure immediate implementation of identified high-impact interventions across the country. Those of this prayer say aye. Nobody is for the prayer. Okay. Those against say nay. That is it. Prayer 3. Urge the federal government to urgently review the national educational curricula to produce market-relevant graduates, and in particular declare an emergency to address girls' education in the country. Those in favor prayer 3 say aye. Those against say nay. Ayes have it. Prayer 4. Urge the federal government to adjourn till tomorrow, Thursday, the 12th day of March 2020 at 10 a.m. prompt. Say aye. March 2020 at 10 a.m. prompt.